everybody, and welcome to the night's virtual class on crappie fishing. This is one of my favorite ones we do every year and some of the highest attendance we get every year, so I know this is a really passionate subject for a lot of people. Just a little overview of what we're going to talk about tonight is distribution of crappie, where they're found, a little bit about the biology, again, kind of the type habitat that they like, what they feed on. We're going to talk a little bit about the creel limit, size limits. You'll see when we get there, all of this varies greatly from tributary to tributary across the state. Some methods and the proper tackle, rods and reel setups, things like that. And then talking about finding places to fish. So let's get started with distribution. So you can see this map. I mean, crappie are found all over the United States, really along that Mississippi River, you know, all the way up to the Great Lakes, all the way down into the Gulf and all the tributaries basically around it. Crappie can be found. So going into biology, there is two different types of crappie. One is known as the white crappie, and the other is the black crappie. For all things related to catching them and regulations, there's nothing that you absolutely have to know. As far as I know, there's no tributary in the state that is gonna have a limit on one or the other. It's just a combined creel limit. But there is some things to know about them. You can see there that obviously the black crappie is a lot darker. They do have more spines up there on their dorsal fin. You can see 7 or 8 there compared to the 5 or 6 on a white crappie. And the blotches are dark and irregular. But overall, if you catch two crappie, one's a white, one's a black, it's going to be very noticeable that that fish is just a little bit darker. As far as their mannerisms, you know, there is very little difference as far as where one's found and the other. The only thing I could say is I tend to find more black crappie in, let's say, backwater oxbows and you know, things that's got heavy vegetative cover, cypress trees, down cover, and those black crappie tend to cling to that type stuff, where you will occasionally see white crappie out roaming on random flats in schools, but normally you're going to see black crappie around more structure. As far as what they eat, things like that, you're just not going to see a lot of difference. And then that kind of brings us to the feeding habits of crappie. Depending on the size, you can imagine when they're young and they're small, they're eating smaller insects, small crawfish, larvae, things like that. And then as they get a little bit bigger, their diet here in Tennessee is pretty much going to move over into minnows, you know, respectively sized minnows and crawfish. So as I mentioned earlier, talking about, you know, February and March being a really good time to catch these fish, and it really comes down to what those fish are doing this time of year. So they've spent most of their winter months kind of in deeper water, in big schools, really not being as active as they are as this water temperature starts to rise. So as we go into March and April and our days start to get a little longer, you know, temperature is rising, which is going to increase our water temperature. Those fish are thinking more and more about spawning, and they're starting to feed up from, you know, being in the winter areas all winter. So right now, those fish are kind of in a transition area, and you can see there that starting end of March, 1st of April, those fish are going to start spawning as the water temperature rises up to around 60 degrees. So right now, it's still a little bit early. You're probably not going to see a whole lot of crappie up in the, you know, 3 to 5 foot range. Most of them are probably kind of in that transition zone. But as we get into March, and especially if we get some several warm days in a row, you're going to get some fish moving up, and that's my favorite time to catch them. You know, if you don't have a lot of electronics on your boat, or you're fishing from the bank and things like that, this is a time when these fish are moving up into shallower water, and they're going to get around different types of structure before they make their final move to go up and get on nests and start to spawn. So any questions around kind of the life cycle of a crappie? So we talked about winter areas, which is kind of what we're dealing with, going up into spawn. They're gonna stay up shallow until they get done doing their thing sometime around the end of April, and then they're gonna pull back out. I find that wintering areas and summer areas are pretty similar. You know, they're just going to deeper water. In the summer, they're doing it just because that's where the oxygen is. As your water temperature gets higher and higher, you know, there's just some cooler water and more oxygen out there in the deep. So here's a time, if you would like, I'll answer a few of the questions we've already got. We have one that was submitted before the class got started, and it was a really good question. Rick asked the question, how does dropping of a lake level affect fishing? And I found that question to be pretty relevant because you've seen all the rain we've had in the last, 2 to 3 weeks, and it's had these different tributaries really acting crazy as far as their water level. I fish in Kentucky Lake a lot. I go by Kentucky Lake level at Perryville. So I know I looked about 7 or 8 days ago and it was up 364, 365, which is really high for this time of year. Winter pool was around 355. So that water got really high, and then they dropped it back down to around winter pool. It stayed there like 2 days, and then we got this other big rain, and it's back on the rise again. So if you think about a fish as the water rises and there's food that they're having access to up into some of the shallower areas, and there's new water on new structures up there in some of the areas that was only a foot or 2 foot deep. There's a lot of fish that will pull up. They're going to distribute across some of that new water. They're going to feed on the crawfish and different things that they've got access to, and it scatters those fish to a big extent. And then as the water level falls, those fish are pulling back from those areas, and I find they cling to structure on their way back out. If I was fishing a hard fall, I would try to be in that transition zone of what the water's coming out of to the structure that's going to be the next stopping point before they go back to where they're forced to when you get back to the winter pool. But it does seem to really affect the bite. I don't know if it is because there is such a surplus of bait up there that they can feed on, or if it just kind of got them messed up because, the water's getting pulled out from under them and they're on a move and they're worried more about, getting back out into deeper water than, in deeper water just for survival purposes, basically. But, I do find that it takes a few days once that water gets pulled back down to stabilize, and then the fish kind of go back to bite. That's my experiences. Some other questions we've had. There's some questions here. Let's see, Darius has a question about using fish finders to find structure. And I did do one on fishing electronics, or maybe it's coming up here in the spring, but we can talk more. Feel free to send me an email and maybe I can help you with some of the settings, and definitely tune into that fishing electronics virtual class. Joseph asked, when we're talking about spawning times, are we talking about air temperature or water temperature? And I'm talking about water temperature. So generally it takes, a little bit longer as the days warm up for the water temperature to come up. Stephanie had a question. So what if it gets really cold and then heats up and goes back cold really fast? I've seen that happen a bunch of times when you get a cold front in March, and it will a lot of times make those fish pull back out as that water temperature drops again. And then once you get some warm temperatures and your water temperature comes back up, those fish will pull back up. So that's a really good question. All right, let's move into some of our creel limits and size limit stuff. So statewide, the creel limit for crappie is 15 with a 10-inch minimum. So you can see there the way that fish is measured. Basically, you want to have the mouth shut to the end of your tape. I use a golden rule. A golden rule is an L-shaped ruler that basically has a stopping point, so you can put those fish all the way down on it, and they have to measure 10 inches. I will say, if you're putting a fish on ice instead of a live well, so they're getting cold, I've seen fish shrink, you know, an eighth inch or a quarter inch over the course of a day as they die and then get cold. So I always try to be a little conservative with what I keep. You know, if a fish is not 10 1/4 inches, probably not going to keep him. But it does get a little more complicated than just a straight 15 limit 10-inch thing, because if you look across the state, there is a lot of exceptions. I just quickly looked through some of the stuff in the regulations handbook. Region 1 has a crappie exception unless otherwise noted for specific waters. It's got a 30 limit with no size limit. And then there's a ton of reservoir specific. So really, I would suggest going to the fishing regulations guide and looking at whatever reservoir that you're going to be fishing. If you've never fished there before, till you get familiar with it, make sure that there's not any kind of special regulations around it. Another prime example, I seen Pickwick for either species, white or black crappie, is 30 per day in combination with a 9-inch minimum length limit. There's probably some reservoirs in the state that's got a 12-inch length limit. So every reservoir really is managed differently, and that kind of makes sense. It's not a one-size-fits-all management strategy. Each reservoir kind of has different management needs for their crappie, so that's the reason for that. But just make sure you check those regulations before you go out and keep a bunch of crappie. Michael asks, how do you measure water temperature? So most any fish finder today will measure water temperature, and it'll display it. If you don't have access to one, there is a lot of ways you can look it up. I know TVA has some apps that probably has some water temperature on it. That's where I also check my lake levels, is through the TVA app. But you could definitely Google a certain area of a tributary and probably get a pretty good water temperature reading. So, all right, I want to talk a little bit about the different methods for catching crappie. You know, I broke it down into some of the general things as far as techniques, but casting for crappie is a very general term. But basically, when we're talking about casting for crappie, we're talking about throwing at certain structures. This is a way to cover more water faster, and then maybe you're going to swap to a different technique once you've located some fish. This is you can see Bill Dance here with a fish attractor. And basically these are marked, when the state sinks them, they're marked by these fish attractor buoys. And then also there's stake mats that you might see on some of your public waters, and they're normally marked by pieces of PVC. So when I'm talking about casting to crappie, I'm normally talking about throwing at a piece of structure like that. And the rods and reels that I'm generally using is going to be a spinning reel. You're normally throwing a lighter, smaller lure. 7-foot medium or medium light rod helps me throw a little bit further, especially in some wind, without as much effort. And then you don't need a great big spinning reel. About a 2000 series spinning reel with about 6 to 8 pound monofilament is about where I land on it. When I'm talking about throwing at stake mats especially, a lot of the time I'm using some type of a bobber or a fish indicator up above a tube jig, or you can see pictured there, a hair jig. There's a bunch of different minnow imitating lures out there that's plastic that you can put on a jig head. And then there's several different ways that you can do your bobber, your strike indicator. I generally use a slip float technique, this is using a bobber stopper on the line. You can reel that up into the end eye of the hook or end eye of the rod, and then it allows for a little bit easier casting because you're able to get that split shot and all your weight up closer to the rod tip. So that's the technique I go. A lot of the people I fish with use a snap-on bobber like the one you see pictured there to the right. Some advantages to it is, you can pop that thing up in the water column, and you can use a little bit lighter weight on your jig head and let it fall real slowly. I also have a friend that I fish with a whole lot, and as you reel, if you throw past a stake mat or you throw past a piece of cover and you're reeling that bobber up to it, it normally kind of spins in the water column. So once you get that bait stopped and that lure starts to fall down into where you think the crappie are going to be, it'll kind of unwind those winds that it made as it was moving up to it and add a little extra motion to it. So that's some tips on doing that. Let's see. James asked to go into a little bit more detail about the fish attractors. So really the first thing when I'm pulling up on whether a fish attractor or a stake mat, I'm looking at water depth around it. So based on how deep that water is to the top of that stake mat, that's the depth that I'm going to adjust my bobber, whether it's a snap-on or a bobber stopper. So let's just say we're in 6 foot of water. There's a stake mat that's 3 foot up or something like that. I'm going to want that bait to stay right over the top of it. So I would set, my bobber to around 5 foot so that bait's down there. Now, some of the stake mats are going to have stakes that run all the way to the top, and then you're kind of fishing in between the two. I try to keep a pretty disciplined technique when I pull up on one. Sometimes it depends on how hard the wind's blowing or if you're having to fish kind of a crosswind, but I'm going to fish the outsides first. One thing to keep in mind, I don't want to throw a bait into the middle of a stake mat or a fish attractor. One, take the chance of hanging it and then having to go in and get it unhung, or two, hanging a big crappie that's going to take my lure and go into some of that thick stuff and possibly break my line or wrap up or something like that. I want to try to give him the opportunity to come out of that cover and get my bait before I make my first cast right into the middle of it. So that being said, the depth of it, and then start on the outsides, left, right, and then make you a cast up the middle. And depending on, how you're fishing, if you're fishing from a boat and you've got a lot of other pieces of structure that that you can fish, then I'm not going to spend just a ton of time on each one. I'm going to give it 4 or 5 good casts, get the bait in the right area, and then I'm going to move on. Let's see. Yeah, Darius has a good question here. Crappie typically strike up, so that is something good to keep in mind. A fish, their eyes are in the top of their head, so if I'm going to be high or low in the water column, I'm going to tend to try to be a little bit higher than low. A lot of the fish are going to be a foot or two off the bottom, and it's not unheard of, for a fish to move 3, 4, 5 foot up the water column to get a lure. So moving on, still talking about casting, and now we're talking about not using a bobber. Some of the lures that I like, you've got a Roadrunner there. A Roadrunner is a jig head with a blade on the bottom. It adds a little flash and vibration along with the movement of a tube jig or something like the Strike King lure that's below it. There is also jig heads that have the blade above it. I can't really say that one works better than the other. I do find that the ones that have it above it, they tend to come through cover a little bit better. They have something, kind of blocking the tip of the hook, where a Roadrunner style is generally used in more open water. That would be my only addition to when you're using a bladed jig head like that. And then the one on the bottom there, basically that's a little miniature swim bait. So that tail paddles back and forth, creates a vibration, And it is, when I'm just out fun fishing and trying to catch anything that'll bite, that's called a Slabalicious by Strike King. It's about a 2-inch long bait. You can throw it on an 1/8 ounce jig head, and it's just a bait that it catches all kinds of fish, from bass to crappie to big brim. And then the top lure there is another bait. There's a bunch of different manufacturers that make them, but still just imitating that minnow. You can throw it on a jig head, throw it, let it sink off the bottom, pop it up and down, or you can put it under a float like we had talked about earlier. So the second strategy, as far as lure presentation to me, is going to be, they're calling it probing. You know, a lot of us country guys over here in West Tennessee call it dobbing, but basically you're using something like an 8 to a 16 foot long pole. I normally use about a 10 foot, 12 foot is certainly doable. And then, you can go all the way up to 16 foot, but the trade-off is going to be, if you're fishing 6 foot deep with a 16 foot pole, as soon as you get a fish on, you got to start, pulling some of the pole back to be able to get to that fish. So it really is very situational. But what this type fishing is going to do, it's going to allow you to get a bait in the strike zone a little bit longer. You're not having the wind blow your float out, or you're not having to reel it at a certain speed to keep it in the strike zone. I can take that long pole and I can put that bait in the exact depth that I want it up against that structure, and it's just a way more efficient way of fishing. I also find that if you're out on a really windy day and you're trying to throw these little bitty light baits up, against cover, you get hung a lot. The wind's blowing you all over the place, where you can just take a long pole and a little bit heavier weight and put that bait right where you need it. Another strategy around fishing for crappie is going to be some type of trolling. So here I kind of highlighted spider rigging, which is a way of pushing rods out the front. And you can see this lady there. She's got about eight or nine rods distributed out the front. And then there is another technique of trolling where you would have rods out the back and troll something like that Roadrunner we discussed, or crankbaits. I would say here in Tennessee, the more popular route is the spider rigging like this. So basically what you're looking at is just rod holders. You can make some more makeshift style. There's a ton of different manufacturers that make the rod holders like you see, and you're just setting up on the front of the boat. You're using the trolling motor to move around out in the open water. You're not going to fish around structure as much with this technique, just because, if you come across a log or something like that with that many rods out down deep in the water column, you're probably going to hang some of them. So you want to try to drag those lures right over the top of the structure if you're coming across structure while you're trolling. So this is some of the rigs like I use. This is a Capps and Coleman trolling rig. You can buy them at Walmart. Basically, it's a 2-hook set, and you can buy all different sizes of weights. If you're going to be trolling at lower speeds in not as much wind, you can get by with a lot less lead. If you're going to be trolling, in heavy wind conditions, you're out on open water, you might want to go up to 3/4 ounce or a 1 ounce weight. Again, there's some variations in hook size and different things like that. So when we're talking about using these rigs, we're talking about using minnows. Now, a lot of people do the same technique with tube jigs or some of the artificial lures like we've talked about, but generally we're talking about nose hooking minnows, and you can see the way that's hooked because you are pushing that minnow forward. If you hook them through the back or through the tail, they're just going to flip around, and that current being pulled reverse against their gills, it's going to kill those minnows pretty quick. So any questions around troll? Oops, ahead of myself. Any questions around trolling and the baits and things like that? Got a question here about bank fishing. You can certainly fish for crappie from the bank. That's one of the advantages, especially in the spring of the year when those fish are pulling up into shallower waters. And if you got that set up like I'm talking about, you can find different pieces of structure and stuff like that and throw at it and be very effective from the bank. The only problem with, crappie fishing is once you fish a certain piece of structure, there's a good chance that, you're going to catch everything that's there pretty quick, and then it's going to be time to walk on down the bank and, move on to other pieces of structure as you go out through the day. It's not like, we had a white bass virtual class a few weeks ago, and it's a very replenishing style of fishing where you can just sit in one spot and there'll be a new school move in or more fish pull in. But crappie fishing generally, unless you're on some kind of a ledge or some kind of a creek channel that's got fish really in a transition, you're going to have to move around as you go up and down the bank. Jim asked, what about red worms or crickets? They definitely will eat that. But generally, when we're talking about that stuff, we're talking more about brim. And if you were trying to use them for crappie fishing, it's going to be harder to keep the brim off of it, than catch crappie with it, I think. So let's move on into one of the newer styles and techniques of fishing. And that's just talking about forward-facing sonar or Liv Scope. There's a bunch of different manufacturers that's doing it. It's a very controversial subject these days just because it is almost like playing a video game. And I think I've got a video, let's see. Ooh. Yeah, here's some imaging from Liv Scope, but if this was live, you would be able to actually see those fish moving in real time. You can see your lure on the Liv Scope, and you can actually watch these fish come up and eat it, or if they react to it, and they swim away, they come up and they push it with their nose, and you can make adjustments by being able to see this on these forward-facing sonar units. It's definitely a learning curve as far as being able to identify different sizes of fish on forward-facing sonar. I'm definitely not a pro at it by no means. I spend a lot of time on probably fish on there that is not my target fish, but these guys that do it a lot, they can tell you exactly the length of the crappie, and it's just really amazing what it can do. So it would be hard to do a crappie fishing virtual class and not talk about forward-facing sonar because it is such a tool today. There's a lot of people that have gotten away from trolling with multiple rods, and they went to this live scoping technique, allowing them to use electronics and one rod and be just as efficient as it was when they were using 8 rods and covering a lot of water. Sarah asked, what does creel mean? Just talking about the creel limit, so the limit in which you can keep. All right. So I get a lot of questions about different access points and different places that you can launch your boat from, where you can fish, where you can't fish. This is off the TWRA app. There is the GIS interactive map function that you can click on. And when you scroll in on that map, this is basically what you're looking at. So you can see there, I clicked on Brody's Landing right there along Kentucky Lake. And it gives you all this different information about that landing. This is pretty much for any reservoir across the state. You can get this information. Google directions, those reservoir specific regulations. That's very important. When when this area is going to be open or closed, and just a lot of detail there. So that is definitely something to keep in your toolbox when you're trying to plan your trip. And then I am having an in-person crappie fishing workshop here in 2 weeks, March 2nd at the Beach River Watershed Development Authority office. You guys feel free to come join us with that. And let's see, I think I can, see if I can, I'll add the registration link to the email that you guys will be receiving with the recording. That should go out tomorrow or the next day. But this is just kind of a way of getting more hands-on, talking more about the lures and the strategies that we covered tonight. There's only so much you can teach when you're doing it virtually, so these are really, really helpful, I find. So feel free, if you want to take your crappie fishing knowledge to the next step, then this is a great way to do it. So that's pretty much the end of tonight's class. Have you guys got any more questions? Joseph asked, when using crawfish, do you use the whole thing or just the tails, and how do you hook them? Generally speaking, not a lot of people use crawfish for crappie. Now they do, crappie definitely eat them. You just don't use them a lot. Now, being around some of these small rivers around here, I have used some of the really small crawfish and put them on almost like a brim hook. And it's kind of a catch-all type thing. It's not really when I'm just fishing for crappie. It's just when it's kind of getting April, May, something like that. There's a lot of crawfish in the river system. I'm catching fish that's got crawfish in their bellies. So then I might try to use them. And when I do use them like that, I'm running that hook in the very tail and bringing it out about midway up them. And that's the way I use those. Judy asked a pretty good question. So some of the lures I showed, there wooden hooks in it, and what you use in conjunction with those lures is just called a jig head. So you could do a quick Google search for a crappie jig head, and then you're going to see what I'm talking about with all the different sizes. Basically, I like to be somewhere around an 1/8 ounce jig head when I'm talking about crappie fishing. Dakota asked, what's the best time of the year to fish at night for crappie? I am not a very experienced night angler for crappie, but the little bit I have, it's always been in the hot summer months. One, for me, it's, getting up to 100 degrees during the day and just trying to seek some shelter from that heat myself. And I think it kind of does the same thing for them crappie. They move up into some shallower areas and get in some positions that you can catch them more at night. So generally in the summer is when I catch a crappie at night. And another thing, that's another time where a lot of people are going to have their fish attractor lights out. So, if you've seen a dock that's got a light out and the bugs come to the light and the bugs fall in the water and the fish are eating the bugs, that is a pretty good pattern when we're talking about fishing at night for crappie. William asked a pretty good question about watershed lakes, and I'm going to give you probably the best piece of advice that I've ever seen when it comes to watersheds. Yes, they are, a lot of them very flat, just in the way they're designed, because they are designed to catch water and then release it out of spillway. But generally, those watersheds, no matter the size, around the spillway is going to be some of the deepest parts of the lake. Generally, that's the levee side of the watershed lake. For whatever reason, I guess the bait likes to cling to those spillways. But if you put me on one of them for trying to catch crappie, the very first place I'm going to fish is going to be around that spillway. And I've had some days where I never had to leave. You just catch a lot of fish around those spillways on the watershed. So that might be a good starting point. And then after you've fished it, move off, fish some of your other structure, kind of see how it's going. And then if you had some success, you can let that thing rest, come back, fish it again later in the day. Got a question from Will Mack about what size hooks, and crappie hooks is a little different than talking about bass hooks. In the bass world, we're talking about 1/0, 2/0, 3/0, and then when you're talking about crappie, you're normally talking about a size hook. And I want to say that it's like a size 1 or a size 2, but basically you're trying to look at something that's about the size of your pinky finger or ring finger or something like that as far as your gap. As far as telling you an actual size of the hook, if you're talking about especially like a minnow hook, I can't quote a certain size hook. Jim asked a really good question. Have you ever used or have an opinion on power bait or crappie niblets? It's a lot like some of the other scent attractants that come for bass fishing. I have seen days where either it is making a huge difference or it just gets in your head that it's making a difference and it's a confidence thing. But I have definitely seen days where somebody with a niblet or with a lure that has a certain fragrance, there's different sprays and dips that you can buy that does really a lot of the same thing. I've seen days that it definitely makes a difference. So, the only trade-off, Jim, when you're talking about using a crappie niblet or using any kind of a scent or a dip, the trade-off to me is the time you lose that I could have my bait in the water, but I'm spending that time putting that niblet on the hook, making sure that it's dipped in a dip or something like that. So I do still use them quite a bit. I actually use the spray and I keep it in a little container that I can just dip my bait in. But the only downside of doing it definitely ain't gonna hurt, could help you. The downside is gonna be just losing that little bit of time messing with it. Joseph, I've had several area specific questions, and I just can't give much advice from Middle Tennessee over. Some of these patterns and things that we've talked about tonight is going to apply really across the whole state. But as far as like Douglas and Norris, they're all part of the Tennessee River chain of lakes, and I would feel confident in same type things that we talked about for Kentucky Lake. Those fish are doing the same things, and those are lakes that are managed largely by TWRA and TVA, so you're probably going to see some of those fish attractors and stake mats that's been put out. Also, a lot of people put them out and either sink them pretty deep where there's not a marker and they have them marked with a waypoint on their graphs, or there could be some kind of marker that an individual put up. So I would look for those things in the next couple months especially. Clyde asked about the light at night. And I don't know that there is a correct answer for which one's better than others, but every time I've caught crappie under lights at night, it was green. And I don't know if that attracts more bugs or what the situation is, but I believe a lot of your fish attractant lights are green. Jeffrey asked a pretty good question, just talking about an Asian carp being a threat to crappie. It certainly plays a factor. And, there might be some reservoirs that have declined a little bit as far as the crappie population as the Asian carps come on in the last 20 years. We're fighting a pretty big policy front, trying to get different funds and things to help prevent Asian carp in the reservoirs through our policy work, but there's just not a lot you can do about it. The negative side that I see is those Asian carp are getting up in the same areas on those flats that the crappie are spawning on. And because they are kicking up so much mud and different things, it can even play a factor a little bit on the clarity of the water. Obviously, crappie eggs require a certain amount of sunlight to be able to do their thing. So, yeah, it's definitely a threat, and it's definitely something to be aware of. If you're really passionate and worried about the Asian carp, feel free to go to tnwf.org and go to the policy tab, and you can see some of the great work that our team's been doing to try to help prevent that. Any other questions? I know I hadn't got to all of them. We've had a lot of questions, a lot of people attending here tonight, so appreciate everybody attending. So you guys will be receiving a follow-up recording email. I'll include that registration link to the in-person workshop on March 2nd. If you feel inclined, you can use this QR code to donate to the virtual series. This money just kind of goes into trying to put it into marketing so more people are aware of what we're doing. And then you can also sign up for another virtual class by going to tnwf.org/virtual class. If you haven't already, follow us on social media at all the different social media platforms. and I'll stay on for just a little while and answer any last minute questions. But thank you guys for joining